There are many things in life that exhaust us, that push us to the very brink of what we believe we were capable of doing. There are physical activities in particular, but there are also emotional and spiritual activities that leave us feeling very spent, drained, used up. One example, of course, you know where I'll be going with this, is running a marathon or any other physical activity along those lines, an endurance event of some kind, bicycling, swimming, running, all of those things. You want to get to the finish line having spent everything. Because there's nothing worse than one of two things happening. You either get halfway through the race and realize you went out way too fast at the beginning and you've got nothing left in the tank to get you to the finish line, or you finish and you feel bright and cheery and fresh and realize, I really could have done a whole lot better if I'd only put more effort in. That's one of the difficult things about any activity, is making sure that you're spending and expending yourself in a way that gets you to the finish line, having spent everything, having done everything that you could. No regrets, nothing left on the table, no energy that you should have used or could have used or would have used if you had not taken advantage of all of your excuses that were so easily at your fingertips. The Apostle Paul, in fact, might serve as an extreme example, but he frequently commented on how spent and exhausted he was in his ministry. He was a very rugged man, very determined, very challenge-oriented. He didn't stay in one place for too long, not because he got bored or frustrated, but because he knew that there was the next place that needed him. And he was always eager to go on to that next place and do what he hoped would be engaging in amazing things in his work for God. But his work also took a physical and emotional toll on him. Because you don't move as often as Paul did and invest yourself as deeply as Paul did, sacrifice as much as he did, and put yourself in as much danger as he did without feeling physically spent. I'll give you a couple of examples of this. In 2 Corinthians, notice the way that he describes his state here. In 2 Corinthians, I'll give you several passages here. In chapter 12, for example, so near the end of the book, in 2 Corinthians 12, verses 14 and 15. Here for this third time, he writes, I am ready to come to you. And I will not be a burden to you, for I do not seek what is yours, but I seek you. For children are not responsible to save up for their parents, but parents for their children. And I will most gladly spend and be expended for your souls. If I love you the more, am I to be loved the less? In the same book, go back to chapter 4. And notice 2 Corinthians chapter 4 and verse 7. Speaking more broadly of the experiences of himself and the other apostles, he has this to say, but we have this treasure in earthen vessels, that the surpassing greatness of the power may be of God and not from ourselves. We are afflicted in every way, but not crushed, perplexed, but not despairing, persecuted but not forsaken, struck down but not destroyed, always carrying about in the body the dying of Jesus, that the life of Jesus also may be manifested in our body. For we who live are constantly being delivered over to death for Jesus' sake, that the life of Jesus also may be manifested in our mortal flesh. And we don't have time to read it, but in chapter 11, verses 16 and onward, we're familiar with that passage, I'm sure, if we've ever read 2 Corinthians. But he talks about all the ways that he gave of himself in a physical way to the work that he was given to do. That he was shipwrecked and stoned and beaten, and on top of all of that, he has a deep emotional concern for all of the churches with which he had worked. So when you look at the work that Paul did as an apostle, spent is a pretty apt term to describe it. But there are other terms that give a sense of how Paul viewed his work. In 1 Corinthians chapter 9, in two different passages, he uses some very powerful words. In verses 24 through 27, His life as a worker was described as boxing, running, competing, and buffeting his body daily. Earlier in the chapter, in verses 6 through 11, his work as an apostle was called work. He didn't avoid the term work, but he was a soldier and a vine keeper and a shepherd. It was like an ox threshing. These are very evocative terms, aren't they? He uses the word workers in 2 Corinthians 1 and verse 23 and verse 24, and applies the same language to Christians in general in 2 Timothy chapter 2. Notice the way he puts it here in verses 3 through 6. Suffer hardship with me as a good soldier of Christ Jesus. No soldier in active service entangles himself in the affairs of everyday life so that he may please the one who enlisted him as a soldier. And if anyone competes as an athlete, you're not just a soldier, you're competing as an athlete, well, he does not win the prize unless he competes according to the rules. The hard-working farmer. This is not the person who sits on the bench, on the sidelines, in the shade, sipping lemonade. The hard-working farmer ought to be the first to receive his share of the crops. Look at the way that Christians are described in other passages in the New Testament. In Romans 8, verse 37, we are more than conquerors. In 2 Timothy 2, verse 15, workman. In 2 Timothy 2, verse 24, bond servant. In Philippians 1, verse 5, and I want to read this one, we're called participants, or those who participate in the gospel. Notice what he says here in Philippians chapter 1 and verse 3 and onward. I thank my God in all my remembrance of you, always offering prayer with joy in my every prayer for you all, in view of your participation in the gospel from the first day until now. In verse 6, for I am confident of this very thing, that he who began a good work in you will perfect it until the day of Christ Jesus. Participants in the gospel. Maybe put another way, there are no clean jerseys in the church. Nobody gets to sit on the sideline with nothing to do. No clean jerseys. And whatever it is that you can do, do it. Find the niche, find the role, find the job, find what you are good at. Even if it is just one talent, don't bury it in the ground. Find what you can do and start doing it. Now, Paul got to the end of his life feeling like he did just that. I admire Paul very, very much, not just in the sense of a race or a marathon and training and all that. I admire the way that he could look back on his life and truly feel like he'd paced himself properly. That in every stage of his life, both before and after he was a Christian, he poured himself into everything that he did. But not so much that he didn't have anything left to finish. He got to the finish line exactly when he needed to get to the finish line with exactly nothing left in the tank. He gave everything to his work. I mean, he gave everything to his work before he was a Christian, which we'll talk about in just a moment, but gave everything to his work when he did come to know Christ. He says this in 2 Timothy chapter 4. Probably a passage that a lot of us could just quote because we learned it when we were in grade school. It's one of the truly quotable passages in the New Testament. Paul says here, summing up his life in verses 6 through 8, I am already being poured out as a drink offering, and the time of my departure has come. There's a feeling that you get when you know the finish line is just right around the corner. There's maybe an enthusiasm that you feel that the work is almost over. You can't quit now. Quitting 100 yards before the finish line is not finishing. So you can't quit. But I felt that experience so many times in a race before, when you put so much effort, so much pacing, so much thought and energy into this race, and then you see the finish line finally. And suddenly you find a gear that you didn't have a mile earlier. That last bit of energy where your body says, you just have to give it everything you've got for a quarter mile more, And I think that's what Paul was feeling here. He could feel that his time was almost up. He says that again, I'm being poured out. My time of departure has come. I have a sense that this is about the end, that we're nearing the finish line. And I've got to finish right. Verse 7, I've fought the good fight. And what a good fight it was. I finished the course. I kept the faith. I believed there was a finish line that was worth all the effort. I kept the faith. In the future there's laid up for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will award to me on that day, and not only to me, but also to all who have loved His appearing. That's for all of us. You know, when you look back in 1 Corinthians 9 and those last few verses of that chapter, and it talks about the athlete who puts all of his work in to win that crown, that perishable wreath. That's all for us. Not the perishable wreath, but the one in heaven that we're waiting for truly. We put the effort in. But I also appreciate that Paul had this mentality before he was a Christian. His conversion to Jesus Christ was not the beginning of his drive and his work ethic. Even when he was an enemy, he was fully committed. There was a single-mindedness to what he did. There was an intensity. There was a vigor. So in Acts chapter 9, when Jesus tells Ananias, you're about to go meet face to face with the guy who would like to see you dead, and Ananias has some hesitation. Lord, you know that this is the same guy who wants to destroy all of us, right? What's Jesus' answer to the good Christian there in Acts chapter 9? No. I've hand-selected him. And I'm going to show him how much he must suffer for my name's sake. Jesus is saying, I've picked him as a worker. Because he's already a worker. And that's the great thing about Paul when he was Saul of Tarsus. Yeah, God looked at Saul of Tarsus and he was breathing threats against the church, and he was imprisoning people and taking them away in chains to meet with the high priest, and he was signing death certificates. I mean, Paul looked at Saul of Tarsus in a different way than what the Christians looked at him. In Galatians chapter 1, he was still not known by sight to any of the brethren, and they were all afraid of him. All they knew was, this is the guy who wanted to see us dead not that long ago, and now he's claiming to be a Christian. He's claiming to be one of us. What other people saw as a threat, Jesus saw as, potential. Jesus looked at Saul of Tarsus and said, okay, I can work with that. I can work with that. Maybe that's part of the reason why later on in the book of Revelation in chapter 3, he talks about being lukewarm. I wish that you were hot or cold, but you're lukewarm. I have nothing to do with you. I just spit you out. You know, God can work with hot. God can work with cold. And if we're talking about in terms of faith, like maybe hot being someone who's really enthusiastic for Christ and is a believer, and cold being someone who's like a diehard atheist and like diametrically opposed to religion. You know, God looks at it and says, you know what? You got intellect, you got thought, you got enthusiasm. I can work with that. We just got to redirect it. I can work with that. Oh no, here's another running analogy. Why won't he stop? You know what? For the record, I've looked back at the sermons I've preached here in 5 years. I really have not talked about running all that much. Okay? For the record, not talked about running that much. But back in high school, we had a hard time finding kids to join the cross-country team. I don't know why. I don't get it. I don't know. Football players always made fun of us running past them during practice. The thing is, we could always run away from them. We had a hard time finding kids to come out and run on the cross-country team. But you know what we did is, the coaches and the kids that were all, we were on the team, fully invested, ready to go. We would hang out around the tryouts for the soccer teams. And you know that kid that's on the cusp who wants to be varsity, right? And he just doesn't quite make it onto the varsity team. He gets discouraged because he's on JV and he's kicking rocks and I didn't make it on the varsity. We say, hey, you know what? You're fit enough, you could be varsity on the cross-country team. That's kind of the same thing, isn't it? Maybe you're not so good as a soccer player, but you could be a really good cross-country runner. Saul of Tarsus, he had some talent, and he had enthusiasm, and he had vigor, and everything he did with this single-minded focus. And Jesus looked at him and said, okay, right now you're an enemy of the church, but let's redirect that energy, and you'd make a really good apostle. If you just changed your outlook, you'd be a really good apostle. God can work with workers. He can work with workers. Just, you've got to be willing to put some time in and effort. Now I want to shift gears pretty dramatically here because I've got two practical applications to this lesson that are going to take up a bit of our time today. Two practical applications, and they're very different. And I hope you see where I'm going to go with them here, okay? The first is this. Are you too spent to be any good anymore? Do we ever reach a point where we become useless, like the greater part of our life's energy has already been spent and we've got nothing left to give? And just being blunt, if you're not understanding what I'm saying, I'm talking about elderly Christians. When elderly Christians reach a point where physically speaking, and perhaps even mentally speaking, they know that they're not what they used to be. Have we ever reached a point where there is so much behind us in the rearview mirror that we just don't have any usefulness left? Are we just too spent? Too spent to be any good? I'll give you a visualization here. A couple weeks ago, I went down to the ranch with Jason. And Lance was there with us also. We were helping Jason out with just a small project he was doing. And in the morning, before we went and did our project, Jason took us around the ranch. And this is his family's ranch. Generations and generations of Amelongs are buried just not that far from there. And you can also see generations and generations of refrigerators as well. You know, he said, this is basically our family history in refrigerators right here. You know, you have, this is the one that's 80 years old, and this is the one that's 60 years old, and this is the one that's 40 years old, and this is the one that's 20 years old. And they're different levels of rusted out. Of course, funny story there, as he was poking around through his junk pile there, he found a skunk. And Lance and I both went like this. You know what Jason did? He said, grab me that stick over there. He's poking around for a skunk down there, trying to see what it'll do. It was a long car ride home. No, he's good. He's good. But do we ever feel like that sometimes, where I'm just old and rusted out? I'm no good anymore. Put me out to pasture. I'm an old refrigerator. Put me out in the backyard and let me rust out. Well, I've got some things to think about here, okay? Some things for you to ponder here along these lines. Open up your Bibles to Proverbs chapter 20 and notice one of my favorite passages on this in Proverbs 20, verse 29. The glory of young men is their strength, but the honor of old men is their gray hair. When you're young, okay, you've got glory. When you're young, you can run the marathons. When you're young, you've got the voice for leading songs. Don, by the way, still has the voice for leading songs. That was not anything on him. When you're young, you've got the physical attributes to do those things. But you've got to embrace a changing role, not a lessening role, not a diminished role, just a changing role. When you're young, you've got strength. When you're old, you've got gray hair. And that is a kind of glory. I love the attitude in Psalm 71. The writer of Psalm 71 has this to say in verses 17 and 18. Psalm 71. And if you have a subtitle, if your Bible has subtitles, read what the subtitle is there under Psalm 71. Prayer of an old man for deliverance. This is an old man writing here. And this old man says in verses 17 and 18, O God, Thou hast taught me from my youth, and I still declare Thy wondrous deeds. And even when I am old and gray, O God, do not forsake me until I declare Thy strength to this generation, Thy power to all who are to come. Look what his purpose is. He says, when I'm old and gray, my purpose goes from being the physical being, right? Where I've done things with my hands and I've run and I've had the physical abilities. But look what he says there again in verse 18. Don't forsake me until I declare Thy strength to this generation. Because this old man writing Psalm 71, he might not be able to run or lift or speak or do the things that he used to do as a young man. But you know what he can do? He can declare God's glory to the younger generation. He can tell younger believers and unbelievers alike of the things that God has done for him because he has the perspective. And it's a perspective that's inaccessible to people who are younger. Go to Psalm 37 and notice what he says here. There's a phrase here in particular that I want to pick out where he says, I've been young, but now I'm old. Psalm 37, and notice here verses 23 through 26. The steps of a man are established by the Lord, and he delights in his way. When he falls, he shall not be hurled headlong, but the Lord is the one who holds his hand. I have been young, and now I'm old. Yet I have not seen the righteous forsaken, or his descendants begging bread. All day long he's gracious and lends, and his descendants are a blessing. I've been young. I've been there before, young man, young woman, and now I'm old. But now that I'm old, I have the perspective to tell you some things about life and some things about God that I couldn't have known, never did know, wasn't able to know when I was younger and didn't have the perspective. So accept that your role in the kingdom is changing, but it is not a diminished role. Next, elderly Christians need to be seen as a tangible link to our past, to our history, to our heritage. Our elderly brothers and sisters are a reminder that things that are true and things that are honorable and things that are good don't suddenly go out of style just because technology or culture changes around them. True things don't stop being true. Good things don't stop being good. What makes a man or a woman honorable and righteous and truthful and pure and holy in the eyes of God, that doesn't change whether you're talking in the 1st century or the 21st century, 50 years ago or 50 years from now, or until the day that God destroys the earth and its works with intense heat. And our elderly members are a reminder of those things. They're a reminder that things like hospitality, good Bible study, an honest and meaningful prayer life, those things mean something. I remember when I was a kid and before they invented the internet and all that sort of thing, because, I was young and now I am old, so I remember what we used to do when we would visit with people. We'd pull the family photo album out. Before there was such a thing as Facebook and, having 5,000 pictures on your phone of your dog or your breakfast this morning, people used to take pictures with a camera. And when you only had 30 pictures to take, you made sure every one of them was good. You kept every one of them. You didn't take 1,000 pictures and delete 999 of them. And we used to sit around someone's living room, whether it was a relative or someone from church, and we'd open up photo albums and scroll through the pages and who's that and who's that right there? Quite frankly, we're missing that today. We're all so connected on Facebook and Twitter and other ways, and we text and we share so much. We're so connected to each other now. But when I talk to elderly Christians about scrolling through their photos in a photo album, visiting someone at their home. June Ivins is a great example, by the way. She's got the photo wall. And it is her entire family. And you could spend an hour just, well, who's that one? And where was he from? Oh, who's that? And I'll tell you what, you learn a lot more about somebody and you build a relationship a lot more in their home, looking at their photo albums, than you do scrolling through someone's Facebook page and looking at what they had for breakfast this morning. And our elderly brothers and sisters remind us that things like that, they might not be in style, but they sure are good. There's a lot of things we could talk about as well, but I want to get to this point here. Our elderly members are to be honored, but a big part of honoring them is not patronizing them. Respect them like a father or mother, according to 1 Timothy chapter 5, verses 1 and 2. View them as teachers, Titus chapter 2. Make it a joy for them to be what this stage of life calls them to be. Like Hebrews 13, verse 17, speaking of our relationship to our elders, it says here in Hebrews 13, verse 17, obey your leaders and submit to them, for they keep watch over your souls as those who will give an account. Let them do this with joy and not with grief, for this would be unprofitable for you. Now, I know we typically understand that verse to be placing the onus on the elders themselves. You, elders, need to do this with joy. But think about this. Part of that is us making it easy to be joyful about it. They can be joyful about being elders because we are a joy to shepherd. We're a joy to shepherd. Make it a joy for our brothers and sisters to become older. Now, there's a lot that's not joyful, like Ecclesiastes 12 says. It's not physically pleasant in a lot of ways, but let's make it a joy. Younger Christians, let's make it a joy for our elderly brothers and sisters to enter that phase of their service in the kingdom. Now, there's a second application that's different than this, okay? Very different. I want to switch gears again. We've got to have follow-through. We've already noted how Paul viewed the end of his life like a finish line. He crossed it having given everything that he had. Being fully committed to the cause of Christ left him fully spent. Let me say that again. Being fully committed to the cause of Christ left him fully spent. Sadly, though, the Bible is littered with example after example after example of people who started off really well, who started with all of the advantages, so much at their disposal, but they either got distracted, or they became apathetic, or they became discouraged, like a seed that falls into the ground, and immediately it springs up with joy, but has no root. And anytime something difficult happens, or it gets distracted, or the cares of the world, or its anxieties, what happens to it when the sun comes out? It shrivels up and dies. It starts off so well, but it loses something along the way. There is a king in 2 Chronicles chapter chapter 24 who we read about. His name was Joash. Now, Joash was very young when he became king. We'll probably study him here in the next few weeks. His grandmother, Athaliah, awful Athaliah, right? Awful Athaliah, was finally removed from the throne by Jehoiada the priest, a very brave and bold man. And he propped up the young boy king and said, "This is our king, not that awful, wicked granddaughter of Omri. This is our king." Now, as long as Jehoiada the priest was alive, and he lived a long time, well over 100 years, you almost wonder, like, God knew Joash's personality, and God may have imbued Jehoiada with almost a miraculously long life just to give Joash the best possible opportunity. But Jehoiada lived well over 100 years, and as long as Jehoiada was alive, Joash lived a righteous life. He had everything at his disposal. The people loved him. He had Jehoiada the priest supporting him. He had so much at his disposal. But as soon as Jehoiada died, he surrounded himself with sycophants and liars and people who took advantage of him and told him the wrong advice. And he ended up killing Jehoiada's son as well when Jehoiada called him out for it. Started off so well, but failed somewhere along the way. And we wonder why. I'll give you one simple answer. Because he did not listen to the advice of an old man. And as soon as that old man was out of the way, Joash showed his true colors. He showed his true colors. Getting to the finish line in the right way depends a lot on our own focus. My friends, we tend to accomplish the things that we actually want to do. And there's really, practically speaking, aside from flying, there's really nothing you can't accomplish. You just got to set your mind to it. You want to be a doctor? Go be a doctor. It'll take a lot of work, but go be a doctor. You want to run a marathon? Anybody can run a marathon. I'm telling you. Rebecca is training for a marathon. Ooh, she's not here right now, so I can say that. There's not much that you can't do. Like literally, physically can't do. If you set your mind to it, we can accomplish a lot of things if we just want to. And if we don't want to, we don't do it. That's why hobbies go by the wayside, because for a little while we get excited about model trains or something like that, or we take up water painting, watercolor painting. Water painting's not a real thing. Can you imagine that, just having like a wet canvas and going, it's a seagull. But you know, we take up these hobbies and then we kind of lose interest because something else comes up. If you want to go to heaven, you can go to heaven. If you want to be a fully utilized, fully spent worker in God's kingdom, you can be. You can be. There's nothing stopping you except your own excuses. So a lot of it depends on our focus. Working for a paycheck only sustains us so long. And again, hobbies tend to go by the wayside when they get boring to us. But we need to be heavenward focused people who actually want to go to heaven, who ponder it, who dwell upon it. That's why Paul was able to run his race, finish his course, fight his good fight, spend and be expended in the service of other people. Because he wanted to go to heaven. And both 2 Corinthians 4 and Romans 8 and other passages both point out all the suffering I've gone through, light momentary affliction, or the sufferings of this world that cannot be compared to the glory that's revealed in us later. You know, it's worth it. Because Paul wanted to go to heaven. So keep your mind set on heaven. Keep your mind set on Christ, who is seated at the right hand of God, and do not dwell on things of this world. Like Colossians chapter 3 says. Because the things of this world, they'll all be gone one day. And what will you be left with? What will you be left with? Now, if you're not a Christian here this morning, you really ought to be. You have an opportunity right now to make a decision. If I want to keep living for self, keep living for the world, keep living for Satan, maybe unwittingly living for Satan, or I can start living for God. And I have life eternal promised to me at the end of all things. So whatever spiritual need you have, please let it be known by coming forward.